housing affordability, cost of living stuff we've definitely been looking at a lot so far on this channel during our Just Chatting streams. And these articles are a little bit older. Well, not older than previous, but are going back a couple of weeks as well. It's showing that the considerations and the concerns and the facts, the figures are still there. They're continuing. One of the big things that has been proposed as helping to help of housing affordability or available housing stock would be for the development of more no, not that. The development of more apartments of higher density living, higher density housing. And you see examples of people say, well, I don't want new apartment blocks in my backyard. No, we want to keep our low to medium density living. Thank you very much. No, the infrastructure is not there to support this higher density thing. So, yeah, increasing supply. Everyone talks, look, if you can build more houses, build more apartments, and more people can afford a place to live, hopefully that'll drag, not necessarily prices down, but make affordability a lot easier. And so, yep, the 1.2 million figure has been suggested for a while, and how they're going to do that within the constraints of existing city space is, well, you have to increase density. You can't magic 1.2 million residences out of nothing and put them out in the boondocks. If people want to stay relatively close to employment and transport and infrastructure, then that residential areas will have to become higher density. All right, but obviously there's pushback on that. So apartment approvals have hit a high at the end of last year. All right, and you're seeing another spike again in taller apartment blocks. Obviously, there's a slump around COVID and the response. Well, there'd also been a decline post 2015. Probably 15, 20 years ago now would have been about here. I think this particular slump. I'm not sure if that's going to be 2008, but Australia was relatively insulated from the global financial crisis in terms of housing affordability. A few people lost out and things like that. There were articles, I remember there's a couple of case studies, a couple of examples given of people in Adelaide that had brought apartments down on the Glenelg foreshore, so one of the few places in Adelaide where there were relatively high density apartment living. They bought them off plan, and a place had been built, they'd moved in, and suddenly they found themselves in the position where the flow-on effects of the global financial crisis and the slump in apartment desirability meant that their apartments were below water in terms of valuation. And I mean, I think ultimately they've all caught up again, but there was certainly a period there of a couple of years where quite a lot of apartment holders, just by virtue of when those apartment blocks were built and completed, that in essence the entire building was suffering from the same thing the apartment values had created at the wrong time exactly. And there certainly were other apartment developments around Adelaide at the time undergoing the same sort of thing. And it was certainly a city that doesn't have massive numbers of high density apartment blocks. So the few that did come online all at the same time, suddenly finding themselves slumped for value, sort of stood out. This slump post 2015, I sort of remember people getting sick of the idea of your only option is a tiny little apartment. Well, if there's no land coming online and you still want to live close by, you gotta live in high density. So, rezoning impacts housing affordability. Okay, train stations, blah, blah, blah. There should be a statement in here about okay, proportion of households with a gross yearly income of $50,000, so lower income families, rose from 15% 91 to 21% 96. Okay, that's years back, but that's all massively increased in the last 10 to 15 years. Well, see, part of the issue here that they're talking about affordable housing units, etc. Certainly in the centre of Sydney, there are a very few affordable housing units, public housing units as such, and people tend to be really want to really tightly hang on to that because, well, if they were to be commercially redeveloped, the public housing tenant would be well and truly priced out. So, affordable housing program generally restricts eligibility to households with a gross income of less than $138,000, though other factors such as links to the area can be taken into account. I mean, it's still a reasonable income, but when you're talking about living in, say, the city of Sydney, yeah, that's not going to get you very far. And yeah, affordable housing would be is the next step up from social housing, effectively. But saying that these apartments aren't affordable, I mean, a one-bedroom apartment in Waterloo, they're going to give me a price? No, they're not. But the thing is that people are saying, well, areas such as Mascot and Green Square in Sydney or the Docklands in Melbourne, no one would consider them affordable. I mean, they're high desirable areas, and so they're just slightly less expensive than more expensive areas, but they're still expensive. And so affordable housing, well, it's going to be reduced in those areas if you've got lots of other people willing to move in and pay the money. Yeah, it just means that you're running out of affordability. I mean, it's 15 years, things have doubled in price. Yeah, which makes sense, slightly more than doubled in price. But that's coming out of COVID. It doesn't surprise me that you're looking at $1 million for an apartment in that part of Sydney. That, yeah, 15, 20 years ago was half or less. That's really not that surprising. I mean, I don't know why people were complaining and up in arms about it, apart from the fact that people's incomes haven't kept up, and therefore this represents more than 10 times what a low-income earner is earning. And yes, it does price people out of locations. Yes, it does force your lower income workers to move out of regions and move out of areas. That's part of the problem, part of the plague, that trying to cap affordable housing, etc., and that doesn't really exist. The fact Docklands didn't go up very high suggests that it was overpriced to begin with. But yeah, supply doesn't equal affordability because desirability takes over. So yeah, it's difficult to say. And the apartments don't help families. A bit hard to squeeze larger families into smaller apartments. People saying, we want these mid-rise, medium density type units and housing. The Northern European model is interesting. The example I'm thinking of is Norwegian, where they've got these apartment buildings, but it's not just lots of tiny little apartments. It's actually a lot of 4-bedroom units spread across 2 floors. So basically you'd have the front half of the facade on this floor would be the front part of a 4-bedroom to go back and then the back half of the building is the lower part. And then there'd be like an overlapped other 4-bedroom apartment that would have their top floor at the back and their bottom floor at the front. You'd have decent lighting, you'd have decent amount of space, but it is still technically an apartment. And in that space, you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You'd have 8 4-bedroom apartments that were on par with basically a pretty decent 4-bedroom house, standalone house, but in the space of, in the footprint of not much more than a 4-bedroom house to begin with. And so, yeah, you increase the density, but you're still getting the amount of space. Whereas a lot of the apartment blocks are being built as each one of these would be, well, top floor maybe a bit more, but you'd be lucky to have a couple of windows per apartment, and you'd have a lot more apartments jammed in. But yeah, you go and find an affordable 4-bedroom apartment anywhere, good luck. Or unit. So yeah, increasing townhouses, increasing medium density. You could add 1 million plus more homes in the Sydney region if you allowed it without approvals. Yeah, I don't know. That's going to lead to problems with infrastructure, but it's, yeah, difficult there. But housing affordability is just one thing. Cost of living is the big thing. So people having to make decisions about where their limited pay packet goes. Living costs rose in the quarter. Annual increases ranging from 2.3 to 4.2%. Yet I'm sure that they're going to come out with an annual increase of like 2.4%, which will be what people's pay goes up by for in that sort of thing. So high housing and food costs, yeah, not a surprise. So it tracked changes in households' out-of-pocket expenses, seeing how rising costs have felt day to day. Cost of living increases. So those relying on government payments, including pensioner and beneficiary households, recorded the largest rise in living costs, with living costs rising by 4.1 to 4.2%. Guarantee you that government payments are not going up by 4.1 to 4.2% per year annum. Driven in part by high electricity prices as rebates sort of went away. Employee-based households only saw their stuff go up by 2.3%. So, yeah, annual percentage change in excess of 3% for a lot of people, 2.3. So I think that's the one that they're going to say, oh, look, we'll put up our government payments by 2.3%. And it's mortgage interest charge changes, but that's going to go up now that the interest rate's gone up as well. So that's going to impact living costs as well. So housing costs had a 21% jump in electricity prices. Yeah, the electricity bill was a bit of a rude shock, even though consumption hadn't really changed and was fairly efficient. Yeah, they're like, nah, pay us tons more. Rents went up by 4%. Now, if you're renting, you're going to feel that 4% increase. 3.5% to food. Clothing and footwear 3.5%. Housing 5%. Health 3.6%. It seems like private health providers get this annual increase that gets signed off on, and they charge the max percent increase every time, but their quality of service delivery doesn't seem to have changed. Transport and communications didn't really go up. Education 5%, yeah, I can see that. And recreational costs up by 4%. Yeah, okay, I can see that as well. Holiday and costs 5.8%. Yeah. Domestic travel 10%. Yeah, okay, so I don't know if I went through it on an earlier Just Chatting stream, but it's possible. There was a figure in the CPI basket or in the annual thing. It might have been a couple of years ago now. I was looking at it, where 98% of the cost of living goods, or the items in the CPI basket, had rocketed up. And the one thing that stood out as having fallen was international travel. It was the cost for international travel. And this was not long after the end of COVID. So the airlines and cruise lines and other international travel costs were low because they were trying to get people back to it. They were trying to encourage traveller numbers back up again. And so costs or prices had decreased in order to incentivize people to come back. Now, I don't know why people thought that was going to be a permanent thing, but what it had done was it suppressed the increase in cost of living experienced everywhere else. And the point I was making at the time was that people aren't going to discretionary spend on overseas travel if they can't afford to, because all their money is being taken up by increases in fuel, electricity, rent, insurance, food, but that have all increased by 5 to 10%. But the government then says, oh, no, it's only a 2.2% increase because the fall in overseas travel costs has offset it. It's like, well, people aren't taking overseas travel because they can't afford to. Because the real increase, or they've felt what is the experienced increase in day-to-day living costs, doesn't match up with the claims of annual cost of living stuff. So the idea that international travel and accommodation has jumped 24%, yeah, not surprising. I think that's just them finally returning to what their normal baseline is. It was a suppressed baseline. It was a suppressed cost for a couple of years as they try to get people back. So yeah, not a surprise. So that's obviously going to contribute to things as well. Lower electricity and health costs, I don't believe that's the case. Interest rate rise will squeeze households further. Yes, charities saying, look, it's hard to keep up and that it's going to be more difficult for people. Yep. So yeah, like it's when the basics are a struggle, who has discretionary funds for the luxuries? Oh, look, luxury spending's going down. Costs are going down. Yeah, because people can't afford it. So yeah, I don't know that sometimes the way they calculate these figures is really reflective of how people experience living costs. And I mean, one of the things in New South Wales that I know I talked about previously that has been an impact to that is this idea of portable bonds, as in you pay your bond once, and if you're renting, that bond can travel with you, or it's held at the bond agency and is just then reallocated to the new landlord, provided you don't get it taken off you. Yet they missed, I mean, this is from a couple of weeks back, but the deadline to get it delivered was the end of last year. And, well, they've made progress, but, well, they've missed the target, so it's going to be come out. So that means renters in New South Wales are still going to have to basically have 2 bonds worth of money floating around, one currently secured, and the second would be what they then need should they have to move, so that they have a bond in place, which obviously is an additional financial stress because you've got to have you could either have that money sitting aside untouched and ready to go, which is basically in enforced savings, or if you're living bill to bill, paycheck to paycheck, you're going to probably burn through that reserve, but then working out how you're going to come up with an actual bond payment along the way. When you've already got bond money already sitting there, you know that it's going to get moved, it's going to show up. Well, how do you do it? Now, it makes sense to say, look, you pay one bond into the system, into a managed system. You can shift that bond around when you shift around. Great idea. Saves financial stress, saves problems, gives more mobility to renters, more flexibility, their ability to move around things. But yeah, they're saying it's a fairly complicated system in the background, and so their systems weren't quite ready in time, and so they're still coming through with it. It just wasn't going to take place in time. Obviously, then people like the Greens are coming out and saying, "Well, you haven't done enough. You've got to actually deliver on the reform. Can't just say you've done a good thing." And obviously, people are concerned about how it's actually going to work, given that it's not actually working just yet. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It sounds like it's still progressing, and they're still working on it, and it's still still pushing forward.